Welcome to this episode of the Partovi Effect. My name is Mrs. Madi Partovi,
And I'm Dr. Ryan Partovi.
and we are heading right into vaccination and the autism epidemic. We're going to revisit the evidence. And before that, I just wanted to share some stories about our sons.
No, I know.
I was driving Ryan to soccer one day, and then there was a homeless man with his dog on the side of the road. And we had these grass-fed beef sticks. They're like 10 grams of protein. But my mind was just like, oh, it's not enough. That's lame. Nah, don't do it. And then in an instant, Ryan was, Mommy, beef stick. So he handed me the beef stick and I gave it to the gentleman. And on the drive to soccer, I was just so moved that our son would make that choice so quickly. Like,
Right.
what is there for me to give to this man who needs something? And he's been packing food for the poor. I think that kind of development growing on the inside and having it show up in the world, like on the court when he sees something, it's just so extraordinary. And I was very moved by that.
You have tissues over there, by the way.
Yes. And speaking of soccer, I asked him after school one day, how was soccer shots? Did you enjoy it? He goes, no, I didn't enjoy it, Mama. And he told me about all the things that he was frustrated by and teammates that he wanted to play with, but they didn't end up on his team. And then I was just rolling around in my head and I said, Son, I just got something for myself. You don't have to enjoy it. Like you can engage in this activity and you can go through the frustration and you can talk it out and you can work as a team and you can negotiate and you can figure out what it is like to be a team player. And that is a huge benefit. And he nodded his head and he said, Yes, Mama.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's good. What I got for myself as a mom.
Well, I always enjoyed school. I didn't enjoy the repetition of school, but I enjoyed learning. I still do. And I always wanted a school for my kids that they really enjoyed and looked forward to going to. I spent years and we've toured 14 different schools, and I learned a lot about pedagogy. For those who don't know, is like the way things are taught in school. There's a lot of different types of pedagogy out there. There's the majority, which was called traditional pedagogy, which is basically your public schools and your traditional private schools. But then outside of those, there's a lot of other things. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in another episode. But my big grand plan was like, let's get him at a school where he's just loving it. And what I have now come to after the journey that we've been on is not so much that he's got to love school to the point where he's like excited to go or wanting to go, but more like that who he gets to be there and who he is when he comes home is someone that I'm looking forward to spending time with, which is not the same thing, right? It's not the same thing to say, oh, is my child looking forward to going to school? Do they just think it's the best thing ever? That's great if that's your kid. Wonderful. Like, good on you. But there's some kids, and our oldest is definitely one of them, that's just like, no, I'd really prefer to stay home. And he's been very consistent with that from the time he was 3 to now the time he's 7. So for the last 4 years, he's been very consistent that I'd rather stay home. But we have definitely seen how different schools have an effect on how he shows up when he is at home and when he's with us. And that to me has been fascinating and ultimately is now, well, yeah, ideally have a school that your kid loves to go to, but if that's not an option, then look at like how the school is affecting him and altering him and nurturing him or not, or her, obviously.
Yeah. So I got that for myself and my own mothering.
But to me, this is an example of that. That's why
Yes,
I'm just to link those two together. Like
absolutely.
what you're describing is absolutely an example of like, hey, He doesn't have to love every minute of it, but
Like if you don't enjoy something while you're doing it, there's something wrong. And absolutely
Right.
not. Yeah, you develop that the grit and the growth on the inside and this constant mastery of interpersonal development and knowing yourself and developing yourself and how that shows up in the world. And it was a really beautiful thing. Yeah, he got that too.
good.
Yeah.
And I really think there's a pendulum here. And that's actually what I'm noticing in this whole conversation overarching. Like when our parents were kids, there was like this expectation that you would go through life, things would be not fun. You'd get a job that frankly wasn't terribly fun. Like you'd just do that because it's what you needed to do to support your family. And that was like what you did. It was to make money. And then we grew up, I think, at a time where it was like, no, you should pursue your passion, do what you love, no matter what, just have fun with life. And whatever you do should be something that you just are always having a good time doing. And no career can live up to that. Like even a career that you truly do love can live up to that ultra high bar. But it's like the pendulum going whoosh all the way on the opposite direction. And then I think what we're doing now is finding this middle ground, ideally, where it's like, no, yeah, pick something because it's your passion, but that recognize that there's going to be parts of it in practice that are going to be challenging and that you're going to have to put some effort into. It's not all going to be like smooth sailing. I'm just going to show up and they're going to give me a paycheck, or people are just going to come through the door and I don't have to do anything but hang the shingle out, right? I think that is just a more of a realistic view of life and also like optimistic and realistic. It's what's possible, but also like, yeah, what's possible, but also you're going to have to work at it.
Yeah, just like his soccer season, right? He had multiple times where he said, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And then I was walking off the field as a family, and I said, no, he's going to stay in it until he gets his breakthrough. And yeah, he has grown tremendously
Yeah.
on the inside, just working through his perfectionism and his expectations that go unfulfilled. Yeah, so it's
Well, and I think he actually really got a glimpse, perhaps I would say, this last game where he was goalie for only the first half. And in the second half, his coach said, well, let's have him play out because he's not played out all season. And he plays it well when he's out on the field in practice. So why not have him try it? And I said to him, I said, I created it for him. I said, this is just going to be fun. Just go do your best and forget the rest. Don't worry about it. And just go out there and try to score some goals. And if you do, great. And if you don't, great. And he really did. He went out there, he played for the whole second half. And actually, no, he did go out for maybe a tiny bit, but they constantly are rotating the kids through at this age. But yeah, he totally just left that game, even though they didn't win, left the game in a totally different mindset, I think, than he maybe had before. I think he had an appreciation for the challenges of the fielders, right? Because before it's easy to sit back in the goal and be frustrated with oneself and frustrated with the fact that the ball got past six other people before it got to you. But when you're one of those people, you realize the dynamic. And so he got to see that, which was fun.
And here's what I have to say about emotional regulation, right? Many people think that emotional regulation is always staying calm, right? Is always showing up calm. But I really think it's an opportunity to work through the whole spectrum of emotions. Not any one of those emotions being bad. Frustration, anger, resignation, and yeah, and rage. To work those through, to like to feel it in your body, to let it out and to communicate it in a way that doesn't hurt yourself or another person, and then to come back to calm. So there's no bypassing and no gaslighting yourself, that you get to get an opportunity to move through those. Yeah. So that's what we're training him to do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think there's such a tendency as a parent to be like, oh no, they're upset. Oh no, they're sad. Oh no,
And medicate
they're
with a
angry.
treat or
Yeah.
some
Let's go
candy.
get ice cream. Like,
How do I deal with this?
like,
Oh my gosh, I can't deal with this.
yeah,
I'll be quiet.
right. Yeah, right.
So,
No, that's definitely your mom's approach. But yeah.
well,
We love you, mom. But yeah, no, to be quiet. So settle him down, make him be quiet. It's like, how can I make
Yes.
this other human being be quiet? Good luck.
Yes.
But
I was,
what's interesting is the needs are often simple, right? It's core needs, food, usually protein, sleep, love. Occasionally, the child is constipated and needs to go have a bowel movement.
yes.
That's pretty much it, I would say. If you're giving them the proper nutrients, the proper amount of love, the proper nutrition, and the proper sleep, kids are great.
Yeah.
That's been my experience.
Yes. Can I move on to our wonderful little 3-year-old?
You may, absolutely.
So you,
Eventually, we're going to get to the autism and vaccination conversation. I
so
promise
you
it.
that he had this almost obsession about the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde song, the Broadway one called Confrontation.
Much to my chagrin.
Well, he asked you
Not exactly age appropriate, but
what your favorite bad guy song was, and he was listening, he committed to memory, and then he committed it to his soul, and he was always singing, I live inside you forever. So if you know the song, there's this part where so he asked me, Mommy, I just want to listen to the Hyde. And I told him, and these are the lyrics from the song. But son, there's no separating Jekyll from Hyde. And without a blink of an eye, he says, Mommy, but me close my eyes and you disappear. Oh, and then my
Ah.
it's just so pleased. Well, did my 3-year-old just crush me on wordplay?
Yeah, yeah, that's basically what happened there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And oh, I've got it. The other morning, he was very frustrated and fussing because he was very impatient about something.
Mhm.
So I was hearing this fussing from the other side of the house, and all of a sudden it went quiet. I was curious. So I walked into the room, and there was our 7-year-old teaching our 3-year-old how to do deep belly breaths.
Mhm.
And he's showing him the hand postures and how you sit. And the 3-year-old Jean-Luc was actually doing it, engaging in it, and it was working.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful. And then the last few mornings, I love being a mom. Jean-Luc woke up and he was in his alpha wave haze, right? Half awake, half asleep. He just comes in to the bathroom where I was, and he said, Mommy, me love you. And he just went about doing his own thing.
He's definitely got that Cookie Monster feel to his language still. He's in
Yes,
the Cookie Monster
yes, and I
phase.
intentionally don't correct him right now because I know it won't last long.
No, fair enough.
But he's always expressing his love for me.
Yeah. It is very sweet.
Me like you so much.
Yeah, he'll just like put his hand on your
I
face.
know. I want to stay home forever and play with you forever.
Yeah.
And then about 5 minutes later, Mommy, I'm ready to go to school.
Well, and that's to get back to the earlier conversation, that goes to show you that every child is different, right? Because that one is truly does enjoy going to school.
Yeah, and then when I pick him up, the first thing he says, Mommy, I miss you so much. I have a surprise for you. And it's usually something like some piece of foliage, like a flower or a leaf. And I usually keep them, I tell him, I'm going to keep this in my pocket. And whenever I reach into my pocket and feel it, I'm going to think of you. Mommy, that's sweet.
Yeah, he knows.
Just to witness his full self-expression and his expression of love is just really extraordinary and really touching to me. So that's a little snippet of my life as a mom.
Beautiful.
Oh, all right, let's move in.
Okay, let's do it. So, you want to start out by giving us the introduction or the abstract again?
Vaccination and the Autism Epidemic, revisiting the evidence. Autism spectrum disorder, ASD, has risen from a rare condition a few decades ago to a common developmental disorder today. This paper rigorously examines the hypothesis that the expansion of the childhood vaccination program and the cumulative exposure to its neurotoxic and immunotoxic ingredients is a major driver of the autism epidemic. We review historical trends showing a parallel between the increasing vaccine schedule and climbing autism prevalence, and we explore the biological plausibility of a vaccine-induced contribution to ASD through in-depth analysis of vaccine components, such as mercury-based preservatives and aluminum adjuvants, and their potential neuroimmune effects. We identify flaws in many vaccine safety studies, including the use of non-inert placebos and other design limitations, and discuss conflicts of interest that may have compromised research integrity in this field. Notably, we revisit the 2014 CDC whistleblower revelations, suggesting data omissions in a key vaccine autism study. Additional clues from biomedical treatments for autism, including evidence of improvements when underlying toxic and immune abnormalities are addressed, provide further support for a causal link. While alternative explanations for the rise in autism, genetic drift, or diagnostic changes are considered, they appear insufficient to explain the magnitude and timing of the increase. Taken together, the evidence assembled herein makes a compelling case that our aggressive vaccine program warrants critical re-evaluation as a contributing factor in ASD. We conclude with recommendations for future research and policy reforms to ensure vaccine safety and restore public trust, with the ultimate goal of protecting children's health while preserving the benefits of immunization.
And I just want to say something real quick because it's been in the news recently that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Secretary Kennedy, our new HHS secretary, has said that we're going to know at least some, if not all, of the causes of autism by September. And people are wondering, like, how is he going to do that? Well, stay tuned, and I will answer that question at the end. I think the answer will start to emerge as we go through the research and the timeline and all the evidence, but I think that I will, if you remind me at the end, I'll circle back to that and really make it very clear.
Okay.
Any questions before we get started?
Yeah. Well, autism used to be 1 in 10,000.
It's actually 1 in 31 now.
Oh.
So when this was written, which was a few weeks ago when we first announced this, the CDC has just announced that the prevalence is now 1 in 31 children
Okay.
in the United States.
So vaccines have nothing to do with it, then what does?
Well, that is a good question. And I think that it's definitely in many ways, the subject of our investigation here. Autism spectrum disorder, a lot of people call it ASD. I'm not crazy about that. I'm just going to say autism has become increasingly prevalent in recent decades. And that does, I think, form the basis of this whole debate about the causes, right? If you look at it in the 1980s, 1 in 10,000 children, as you mentioned, were diagnosed with autism. Now it's diagnosed in roughly 1 out of 36 children. All this comes from the CDC. It's non-controversial. So the surge in autism diagnoses far outpaces population growth, improved awareness, which indicates that there's some kind of environmental factor at play. It can't be and we'll talk more about this as we go along, but it can't just be, oh, we're diagnosing it more, or we're more aware of it, or that kind of thing. There's something environmental that's going on that is causing this. So during the same period that the autism rates have climbed, the routine childhood vaccination schedule expanded dramatically, which exposed infants to many more vaccine doses and ingredients than in earlier generations. So it's not just the antigen that they're getting exposed to, the viral or bacterial antigen. In fact, I think we've had some people argue about how good those studies are. That's not really my intention, and certainly not our intention. I think in this presentation, this paper was really not to necessarily pick apart the studies that have looked at, say, the MMR vaccine or the Tdap vaccine, and is that linked to autism? It's really to look at the overall program of 74 vaccinations over the course of 18 years and climbing, because now we've got the COVID vaccine added in there, at least 3 doses. Madness. But anyway, is the program of vaccination ultimately what's leading to this increased risk of autism? And what could be that mechanism? So, as we've seen this schedule expand dramatically, we've seen also at the same time infants obviously getting exposed to more vaccine doses and more ingredients than in earlier generations. And so that temporal overlap has led not just parents, but also researchers to question whether aspects of the immunization program, particularly again, this cumulative exposure to certain vaccine components that are probably things that are consistent between most, if not all, of the vaccines, could be contributing to this rise in autism. So, public health authorities, mainstream medical organizations have largely dismissed this vaccine autism connection. I think that goes without saying almost, but it's worth repeating just so people understand. I'm not trying to gaslight anybody. I get that you hear probably the long discredited link between vaccine and autism on an almost daily basis, especially if you're listening to health news like I do. But those claims basically point to a collection of epidemiological studies that appear to show no association. They're often attributing the spike of autism to broader diagnostic criteria, better recognition. They emphasize hypothetical genetic causes, which with autism, like with most genetic diseases, it's not like, oh, you have this gene, you're going to have it. It's, oh, you have this gene, you're more likely to have it. And so the question is, what are the environmental factors that interact with those genetic causes that are going to lead to the development of the syndrome? Critics argue that many of the existing studies were not designed to detect the specific type of harm vaccines may cause, and that potential conflicts of interest call into question the impartiality of the official research on this issue. Moreover, a growing body of biomedical evidence from toxicology, immunology, and clinical observations suggest biological mechanisms by which vaccines could trigger neurodevelopmental damage in susceptible children. And that point of susceptible children is really crucial. We're not really looking at all of the different effects potentially of vaccines or vaccine ingredients. We're really focusing on autism because that's a question that not only is very common in the media right now, but that we have gotten from our friends, right? That's the way the question is asked. And I get that. And that's why we're taking this look. So these concerns can easily be dismissed as coincidence or debunked myths, as long as we have these unanswered questions about vaccine safety science that are dangling. So in this paper, which I will be posting on Substack at some point, it's not quite there yet, but we're going to take a narrative-driven, scientifically rigorous look at the evidence, linking the vaccine program to the autism epidemic. We'll begin by reviewing the historical background and epidemiological data, including this striking correlation, which I can't wait to show you guys the graph, between the expansion of the vaccine schedule and autism's rise. Next, we're going to delve into the key vaccine ingredients of concern, such as mercury and aluminum compounds, as well as the likely mechanisms by which these might induce neurodevelopmental harm, establishing the biological plausibility for a causal role in autism. We then address the mainstream counterarguments in detail, examining potential flaws in the foundational vaccine safety studies, highlighting issues of study design and placebo use. Spoiler alert, they don't actually use real placebos. And considering the impact of financial conflicts of interest on research outcomes, which I think is like the dominant issue of our time in terms of science in general and medicine in particular, is just how much market forces have corrupted scientific investigation. Within this context, we revisit the revelations of a CDC whistleblower who alleged data manipulation in a pivotal autism study, underscoring the need for transparency and integrity in vaccine science. My guess is that whatever that CDC whistleblower knew is likely to come out by September. We also discuss clues from treatment, empirical improvements in some autistic children via biomedical interventions targeting toxins and immune dysfunction, the kind of things we do in our practice, which provide additional support for an environmentally triggered model of autism. So after weighing alternative explanations for the autism increase against the vaccine hypothesis, we'll be outlining future research directions, policy reforms needed to put this debate to bed. The goal really is not just to investigate it, but really to say, well, okay, if in fact there is a case, it needs to be as airtight as possible that cumulative vaccination exposure has been a major driver of the autism epidemic. So we can then chart forth a path to improve vaccine safety by understanding what is it about the vaccines that is actually contributing to autism. And then that's going to help us alter the vaccine formulations to protect children's neurodevelopment. So when we're doing this, we'll be integrating evidence from epidemiology, biology, firsthand accounts, et cetera, to create this clear and compelling reassessment of this controversy that really contains profound public health implications. And I think we'll see that as we go on. Yeah. So anything else you want to hop in at this point and say or ask?
So why is it even dangerous misinformation to even ask that whether injecting infants with dozens of shots might be contributing to this epidemic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that I touched on that already a little bit, but I'll just say that to reemphasize that the way that it's contextualized as dangerous misinformation is primarily an industry talking point, right? It's the idea that, oh, well, this is dangerous because it could be leading to children potentially dying from not getting vaccinated from these communicable diseases, most of which have a very low incident fatality rate. We're talking 0.01% or less. But yeah, I think that to me, if you characterize something as dangerous misinformation, then it's easier to dismiss it, right? And I think that's why it's important that we have such an airtight case here.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
But did you have any questions?
I do. So autism rates began to spike at the exact moment that the vaccine schedule expanded or exploded. How is that not worth investigating? Like, why hasn't it been investigated in depth thus far?
Yeah, well, I think it is worth investigating, and we're about to do it. Autism was first described by Leo Kanner in 1943, and there were only a handful of cases noted in the medical literature at that time. For several decades, it remained a rare diagnosis. So through the 1970s and 80s, prevalence estimates ranged in order of a few cases per 10,000 children. Starting in the 1990s, however, autism rates began a steep ascent. The rise was well documented by the early 2000s. By 2007, the US CDC reported autism prevalence of 1 in 150 children for birth year 1994, which further climbed to 1 in 68 by the 2010 birth cohort. The estimate of 1 in 36 for the 2012 birth year reflected a roughly 200-fold increase in autism diagnoses since the early 1980s. And we've seen now they're coming out saying 1 in 31 is the updated number. And I'm not sure which birth year that represents, but I'm sure we'll know soon. So again, there's been expanded diagnostic criteria, greater awareness. I'm not denying that's contributed to higher reported cases, but those factors alone cannot explain such an enormous increase. That's absurd. People claiming that need to have their heads examined. Careful analyses have estimated the majority of the rise, on an order of 75 to 80%, represents a real increase in autism incidence, not just an artifact. This comes from the study. I'll read you the name of the study. A comparison of temporal trends in the United States autism prevalence to trends in suspected environmental factors by Cynthia Nevison in Environmental Health, published in 2014. In other words, more children truly have autism today than a few decades ago. So that really points back to the idea that new environmental triggers must be involved in the pathogenesis, the cause of autism. So over that same time frame, the US childhood immunization schedule has grown a lot more intensive. In the early 80s, infants received just a handful of vaccines. It was the Tdap. It was actually called the DTP back then: diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, polio, MMR, measles, maybe one or two others. But by 1995, you had new vaccines for Haemophilus influenza type B, which is the HIB vaccine. It's also called HIB. Hepatitis B has been added for all infants, and that's continued to grow through the 2000s. With now we've got the chickenpox vaccine, which we've talked a little bit about that before, about how it's caused the shingles rates to go shoot up since we've had the chickenpox vaccine, because adults are no longer getting that booster of immunity against the virus that causes chickenpox. So it ends up coming back out and causing shingles as adults. The pneumococcal vaccine, the rotavirus vaccine, hepatitis A vaccine, as well as annual flu shots and the COVID vaccine now. So as a result, the number of vaccine doses given to an average child by age 2 roughly tripled from the early 80s to the 2000s. For example, a baby born in 1983 might have received around 8 to 10 inoculations total by age 2. Baby in 2010 could receive around 25 to 30 injections by the same age, some of which are going to be combination shots protecting against multiple diseases. So if you count each disease-specific immunization, the 2013 schedule effectively included vaccination against 14 different illnesses. That's, of course, debatable about how effective that is, but I'm sure we'll get to that eventually, but that's not today's topic, by age 18 months. So 14 different antigen exposures by 18 months. And then figure 1, which I'm about to show you, illustrates the timeline of expanding vaccine schedule alongside autism prevalence data. So I'm going to display our figure 1. And for those who are not watching on YouTube, feel free to go to YouTube to see this. So with figure 1, we're seeing the autism prevalence, which is plotted as 1 in X number of children, and that's going to be the blue line, and then versus the number of vaccine doses in the routine schedule, which is the orange line. And you can see that we've 10 to the 4th power. This is a 1 in 10,000 number. And then now we're 1 in 30, 1 in 36 is where this is. You can see how that's gone up. And it's literally tracked the cumulative vaccine doses by age 5 pretty much perfectly. And both, of course, have really increased dramatically since the early 80s. These are based on CDC surveillance estimates. Vaccine doses are based on the recommended immunization schedule for a child through age 5 in each year. This just is giving you a clear indication of the trend. And this doesn't establish causation, right? We're not there yet, but it's showing that there's a strong correlation, which means, hey, there's something worth investigating here. So the parallel upward trajectories of vaccine dosing and autism diagnoses are pretty apparent by that graph. And of course, like I said, correlation doesn't prove causation, but it's an essential clue that is worth investigation and some scrutiny. In 2004, the Institute of Medicine Immunization Safety Review noted that the autism rise coincided with expanded immunizations, but of course, nonetheless concluded that existing studies did not support a causal. Many officials attributed the correlation to coincidence, given that both vaccination and autism awareness were increasing for other reasons. But subsequent analyses strengthen the argument that the correlation is not merely spurious. Notably, an environmental epidemiology study by Nevison, which I cited earlier, examined numerous potential environmental contributors to the autism surge and found that most had trends that diverged from autism. So she looked at other environmental factors and found that, well, these don't really track along with autism as well as vaccination. For example, leaded gasoline, certain pesticides actually decreased in use from the 90s to the 2000s, and therefore could be ruled out as primary drivers of rising autism. In contrast, one factor stood out for its positive correlation with autism rates: the increased cumulative exposure to aluminum adjuvanted vaccines in early childhood. And again, an adjuvant is basically a toxin that is put in there to stimulate the immune response. In fact, researchers have shown that this correlation satisfies many of the classical Bradford Hill criteria for inferring causality, including the strength of the association and the temporality, how closely the timing matches. So taken together with that sheer magnitude of the concurrent trends, it's elevating the vaccine hypothesis from just a casual observation to a serious contender, which I think is why there's been as much talk about it as there has in terms of explaining where did this epidemic come from. Another study that looked at the correlations was a study by, I don't, how would you pronounce this? Sneha Sheth et al. This was in 2018 in the Journal of Inorganic Biochemistry, probably one of the few that would actually publish something like this. So the question is exposure, the title rather, is exposure to aluminum adjuvants associated with social impairments in mice, a pilot study. And one of the things that they note is that the correlations satisfied 8 out of 9 Hill criteria for causality. For those who know about the Bradford Hill criteria for causality, that's pretty dang good, 8 out of 9. So historically, concerns about vaccines and autism began to gain public attention in the late 90s, which you mentioned to some degree. We've probably most people have heard about the 1998 paper by the British gastroenterologist Andrew Wakefield and his colleagues, which of course was controversial, later retracted under duress. It's a whole fascinating story, which actually Nicole Shanahan and the guy that they had picked to lead CDC that ultimately didn't have enough votes to get confirmed, he ended up, they did an interview. And in that, he sets the record straight on Andrew Wakefield. And then I was listening to Joe Rogan and Dr. Humphreys, and she also mentioned that she knows Andrew Wakefield, and she said he's basically been dragged through the coals by pharma. He'd had several studies that were published, and he was a well-respected guy. And then this one study, right as he was about to publish another study, they retracted this study that came out in 1998, where he reported on a series of children who developed GI, gastrointestinal abnormalities, and then also autistic-like symptoms, regressive developmental characteristics, after the MMR vaccine. The authors of that study hypothesized a connection between the MMR vaccine, intestinal inflammation, and autism. So again, that study, highly controversial, eventually retracted. It ignited a wave of parental reports and further investigations into possible vaccine autism link. And around that time in the United States, suspicions fell on thimerosal, a mercury-based preservative that was used in several infant vaccines through the 1990s. In 1999, and this is really how Bobby Kennedy got into the vaccine space, because there were several parents who basically approached him, mothers predominantly, saying, I think that the mercury in the vaccines has caused my child's illness.
I have a question about thimerosal.
Okay.
If it was safe, then why did they quietly remove it from the vaccines?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that they did that primarily just as a sort of CYA to some degree. I think that they were trying to protect themselves from possible liability because they knew that mercury is a neurotoxin. I think that as they claim that it was as a precaution that in 1999, the US health agencies and vaccine manufacturers agreed to phase thimerosal out of most childhood vaccines, except the flu shot. The flu shot still has the mercury in it. And as Dr. Diadamo likes to say, most people are better off with the flu than the flu shot. So I would stick to that.
I have another question. Why would a study be retracted? Like, what would...
Yeah. Well, in this case, it was several years after. I think it was something like, it wasn't retracted. It was retracted. I want to say it had been at least 5 years, possibly 7 or 8 after this was published, that it was retracted. And it is not typical for a study to be out that long and then ultimately be retracted. It's usually retracted within, oh, somebody finds something wrong with it, and it's within like 2, 3 months, maybe a year, that it would get retracted. So it's pretty atypical for somebody years later to come back and say, well, we're going to have this retracted study. But apparently, What Dr. Humphreys was saying on Rogan was that it was retracted after so much time because they got to his co-author. And basically, by they, pharma, it was either pharma or it was the public health authorities, which again basically work for pharma. Public health, when it started, was really great. And I think that she talks about that in that. It makes some really good points. And I recommend that interview to anybody who hasn't already seen it. But she talks about how public health was really about like cleaning up the streets, making sure we had clean water, making sure there wasn't horse poop and dog poop and every other kind of poop in like just laying around everywhere, which is really how the conditions were for like the vast majority of human history. And so public health, making sure that we had basic nutrition, clean water, these are things which really account for 85 to 90% of the reduction in disease prevalence over the course of the last 100, 150 years. And so public health had a really good start, but then they went down this path of like, well, now we're just all about vaccines and pushing vaccines, which I think is really unfortunate because I think that there's a lot of things that public health could look into around optimizing the terrain of the individual that would really support immunity, support overall well-being and an immune response such that people have very self-limited courses of these diseases, especially these viral illnesses of childhood, which for many, I would say the vast majority of people are just that. They're self-limiting infections. Maybe you get a viral exanthem, like we talked about with measles, but that's pretty much it. Assuming, your nutrients, you're replete with the nutrients that your body needs to fight off the infection and not overreact to it. So much of the mortality from viral illness comes from an overreaction of the immune response, which is driven by a lot of things. I think in our current milieu, a lot of it is like the pesticides and the immunotoxicity from vaccines, and also the nutrient deficiencies from our ultra processed diet, high insulin levels from the ultra processed food. I feel like there's one other thing I'm not remembering right now, but there's definitely quite a few different things that contribute to our increased risk from infection. Obesity is one, obviously, and there's more childhood obesity and being overweight. And that's very tied to insulin resistance. So you see all that, and it's like, well, yeah, okay, that's what we need to be targeting,
Right.
not necessarily the let's get another vaccine, which is going to further contribute to the immunotoxicity and increase lifetime risk of autoimmune diseases and very possibly autism, as we're about to discover. So we talked about thimerosal. We talked about how they phased thimerosal out of most childhood vaccines except for the flu shots due to those safety concerns. And of course, that speculation about that mercury exposure in infancy might be contributing to the neurodevelopmental disorders. However, and this is what's fascinating to me, autism rates continued to climb in the 2000s, even after thimerosal was removed from routine pediatric vaccines, which is why skeptics said, see, we were right all along. Vaccines are exonerated. This is a nothing burger, right? There's nothing to see here. And what this simplistic conclusion overlooked is that there are other vaccine related factors, not just the MMR, but also aluminum adjuvants in vaccines. What they replaced the mercury with was just as toxic. The presence of the aluminum was obviously not affected by the removal of the thimerosal, which is the mercury. And so the hypothesis that I would put forward is it's like, well, you've taken one heavy metal and replaced it with another heavy metal, both of which are highly neurotoxic. You'd expect to see the same continued climb if that's the case. And that's what we've seen. So this timeline of events, first you have the MMR being a cause for concern potentially in the late 90s. Then you have thimerosal getting removed, and then now we're adding the aluminum. It reflects like a shifting hypothesis, which is like, okay, so maybe it's not any one of these things. It's like this cumulative exposure to neurotoxic compounds rather than like, oh, you're just moving the goalpost, which is like the obvious pushback you're going to hear from skeptics. They'll say, oh, and by that, people who are not skeptical of vaccines, but people who are skeptical of the relationship between vaccination and autism. They're going to say, oh, you're moving the goalpost. But that's really not, if you're looking at a cumulative toxic burden model, then you're not actually moving the goalpost at all. And so researchers, I think, were really refining their focus on which components ultimately, and maybe it's like a group or a cluster of components of the ever-growing vaccine schedule that is ultimately underlying that association with autism. So through the 2000s and the 2010s, the United States government commissioned studies, medical establishment repeatedly assured us there's no link. Well, at the same time, you saw tens of thousands of parents continuing to report drastic regression in their children following an immunization, following a dose of a vaccine. And that disconnect has persisted and actually grown sharper, especially after 2004, when the Institute of Medicine issued that report firmly rejecting the causal relationship and essentially closing the door on further federal research into vaccines and autism. So they were like, nope, we're done. And as we continue, we're going to start to see how the core pieces of this puzzle, specifically which biological mechanisms could explain how vaccines could induce autism, why the official studies might have missed or obscured that effect, and whether there's evidence of bias or data suppression in the vaccine research enterprise. So by revisiting this evidence with an open but critical mind, we're going to determine whether the dismissal of this vaccine autism hypothesis was truly justified, or if instead vaccination has been an unrecognized contributor to one of the greatest childhood public health crises of our time.
I have a question. So
Sure.
21 years ago, when they closed the door, that door is still closed.
Well, I think it's opening now that we've got Bobby Kennedy in there. He's saying, no, we're going to reopen this door. The door is not closed.
Okay.
But yeah, Institute of Medicine for probably, you're right, like for 20 years, the door has been closed on the federal level. They weren't even investigating it anymore.
I think a lot can happen in 20 years.
Well, we've seen that the incidence of autism has basically doubled, right?
Right.
If we look at, yeah, I'm just going to go up and see it. As of the publication, it was 1 in 36. In the 2010 birth cohort, it's 1 in 68. That's, what? It's been 15 years and now it's doubled. It's more than doubled, actually, if it's 1 in 231. And that's just been in the last 15 years. Yeah, it just continues to go up and up and up.
Yeah. So I want you to go or answer why the autism curve matches the vaccine schedule so closely, like more than any other environmental factor.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to get to that here. I think that the question of autism rates alongside that vaccine schedule expansion is a really important part of this picture and really difficult to ignore once you see it, right? Because it reflects that raw epidemiological data. And we see that expansion. And this is worth really delving into and really getting granular on because autism diagnoses rising exponentially in the late 1980s, which of course we saw the Vaccine Liability Act, and I forget exactly the name of it off the top of my head right now, but it's the act that basically.
The one that says you can't sue us even if something goes terribly wrong.
Exactly. So that was passed in 1986, and then you saw autism rates really start to skyrocket, just take off in 1989, 3 years later, which is when you would have started to see the effects of the increased vaccine schedule, which followed after 1986. They said, oh, great. Well, we don't have to worry about safety anymore. We'll just start recommending a lot more vaccines. And you see this, even my own sister had asthma and an autoimmune condition. She was part of the after 1986 crew. And my brother and I really didn't have those issues. And they're actually typically more common in men. So, especially the asthma in boys. But yeah, um, I'm not saying there was also evidence that she got exposed to some styrene and stuff like that. But I think that it's interesting to look at how we would see the explosion that happened with the immunization schedule, both in the number of vaccines and the frequency of doses given to infants and young children, and that it really did increased dramatically. In fact, I believe Children's Health Defense they have a little bit of a graph, and I want to show it real quick. I wasn't planning on doing this, but you see it. Yeah, it's so funny. The only way to find this is if you go to Children's Health Defense and you actually search their website, because Google won't find it for you. That's how heavily censored this information is. Pretty fascinating, right? Yeah, this is the only way. You actually have to physically, manually search for this information because otherwise you're not going to find it. And you have to manually put in their site, children'shealthdefense.org, and then look at the schedule. So this to me is a pretty compelling illustration of what we're talking about here. 1986, when the law was passed, 12 total shots. This is from birth through 18 years. That's more accurate because we're looking at 2 months old, that kind of thing. So 12 shots, a total of 25 antigens, 8 diseases vaccinated against. This is 1986. 2019, of course, pre-COVID, 54 shots. It's now up to 74, by the way. 70 antigens. I think that's now over 100. And then 16 diseases. So this is just in the 33 years between these two time points. That's a good illustration of what we're talking about here. Look at all those flu shots. My goodness, one flu shot a year. And the mortality from the flu shot in children is just not very high, especially if they're using elderberry right away, which is what they should be doing. If your child has a fever of 102 or above and they've got body aches, they should be on elderberry. Pretty high dose. Why not, right? In our practice, we do 2 teaspoons every 2 hours for the first couple days. And then once the fevers come down and they're feeling better, we do 2 teaspoons every 4 hours until well. But that's for kids that are probably 12 and up. For younger kids, you can just do 1 teaspoon. All right, little sidetrack there, but I just wanted to show you have this congruence of the two trends that we saw also back in figure 1. It's really striking, and it's been noted by both proponents and skeptics of the vaccine connection. So by 2013, a child following the CDC guidelines would receive approximately 28 injections of 10 different vaccines. So we saw that by 2019, it was even more, right? But this is actually by 2013, a child following guidelines would receive approximately 28 injections of 10 different vaccines by age 2. Okay. By age 2. So some vaccines are obviously given in multiple doses. That's why it doesn't exactly line up, as compared to 3 to 4 vaccines in the early 80s. So again, this is just looking at the 30, basically around 30 years later, we have increased the amount of injections, increased the total number of vaccines dramatically. And the rise in autism diagnoses during that interval was on the order of over 100-fold. From, we estimated in 1980, about 0.01% of children would get diagnosed, to by 2018, 2% of children will be diagnosed with autism. So that's, again, not proof of causation, but we have to keep it in mind because it's very consistent with our hypothesis and suggests that if the vaccines are contributing, they would have a pretty large impact.
Wait, so if it's not vaccines, then what new exposure started in the late 80s could explain a 200-fold rise
Right.
in
Well,
autism?
exactly. And that is what a lot of people will answer by pointing to other factors. They'll say, oh, improved awareness, diagnostic broadening. And yes, those have obviously increased the autism counts. But using both California and national data, Nevison, who we talked about before, separated the trend out into portions that were attributable to the diagnostic changes versus the true rise. And she concluded that roughly 75 to 80% of the increase from the late 80s to early 2000s represented a real increase in autism occurrence beyond what better identification could possibly explain. In other words, even after we adjust for the non-causal factors, autism truly becomes far more common in that time frame. So again, what that leads us back to is a much greater likelihood of environmental cause versus any other cause. And her analysis really compared autism not just to vaccines, but to numerous environmental variables. She looked at air pollution, maternal age, chemical exposures, but the most relevant risk factors, most of those didn't show any correlation with autism. In fact, a lot of them, as we said before, declined over time. So you had lead pollution, pesticides, turned out not really as great of an association as you'd hope or as you might think. But the exceptions were the few factors that increased in lockstep with autism. And among those, the cumulative aluminum adjuvant exposure from vaccines stood out, as did the use of certain persistent organic pollutants and herbicides introduced in the 1990s. So it's not the only possible thing that's increasing the rates, but it's one of a very short list. So those findings led credence to this idea that something about the changing vaccine program may have been a driving force behind the autism epidemic. And it's important, yes, obviously, as we've said, that correlation alone cannot establish causality, but it can help us generate a hypothesis that are then evaluated with further data on mechanisms, which we're about to get to, and specificity. In the case of vaccine and autism, the hypothesis is that the increased vaccine exposure, especially to particular ingredients, is an environmental trigger for autism in a subset of children. That doesn't mean that there's no effects on other children, but it means that only in a certain subset of children is autism going to be the result of this exposure. So if that hypothesis is true, one would expect to see exactly what we do see, right? Autism rates rising as vaccine doses increase. And one would also predict that the groups of children who received more vaccines earlier in life may have higher autism risk than those who received fewer or later, which is exactly the pattern we observe. One would look for biological evidence that the vaccine components, this is the next step, right, have the capacity to cause the neural damage consistent with autism. And that's what we have to see. We have to see that plausible mechanism, which we're going to get to next. The temporal association becomes one piece of a much larger puzzle then. By itself, this upward march of the two curves is suggestive, right? If we combine it with the toxicological data, the clinical evidence, it becomes compelling. And as noted by the researchers we mentioned before, in the vaccine autism correlation, not just in the United States, but in multiple countries, satisfies 8 of 9 of the Bradford Hill criteria, which is what is used in epidemiology to infer causation. And so these are things like coherence with laboratory science, temporality, the things that we're talking about. In fact, experimental findings, which we're about to get to, actually demonstrate that the more aluminum-containing vaccines young animals receive, the more profound the neurodevelopmental harm observed, which of course aligns with all these epidemiological correlations that we've discussed. So in summary, looking at the correlation, the expansion of the vaccine schedule, the surge in autism diagnoses occurred in the same era, affected the same birth cohorts. This strong correlation and the lack of similarly correlated alternatives warrants serious consideration. Dismissing it as outright coincidence is scientifically unsatisfying, especially given the high stakes. And these are high stakes, no doubt about it. The logical next step is to examine whether there are known biological mechanisms by which the vaccines or specific ingredients therein could plausibly be causing or contributing to autism in some children. And if we can find those mechanisms, if they exist and they're supported by evidence, the case for causation is greatly strengthened. So let's talk about vaccine components of interest and theoretical mechanisms. If the vaccines are to blame, even partially, for the development of autism, how might they be doing it? Vaccination obviously is not a single entity. And I think that's one of the things that we have to really emphasize. It's a broad exposure, including many different pharmaceutical ingredients and immune stimulants. So researchers who consider this vaccine autism link typically focus on two types of mechanisms. either direct neurotoxicity of vaccine ingredients, especially those containing heavy metals or chemicals that can affect brain development, or immune-mediated damage, where the vaccination is triggering an abnormal immune response, inflammation, autoimmunity, immune overstimulation, that secondarily harms the developing brain. And I think it's very plausible that either or both of those could be involved here. I wouldn't rule either out yet. And as we've said here, these are not mutually exclusive. You could absolutely have both. In fact, they could be synergistic to some degree because some vaccine ingredients, like the adjuvants, are specifically designed to provoke strong immune activation, which in turn can have neurological effects. I have a 7-year-old new patient coming on board, and his family suspects that it's very plausible because of the temporality of, hey, he had a flu shot containing, and he never had a flu shot before, and then suddenly he started having seizures shortly thereafter. Is that definite for sure? The temporality is suspicious, I would say, and there's certainly a mechanism that we're about to get to looking at the thimerosal. So we're going to talk about thimerosal, we're going to talk about aluminum, and looking at the biological plausibility in contributing to autism. All right, now we're going to talk about just the mercury derivative and a neurotoxic preservative, in addition to being an immune stimulating adjuvant. That is an organic mercury compound. That's 49% ethyl mercury by weight that was used allegedly as a preservative, but we know that it also has an adjuvant effect in the sense that anytime you have something that's toxic, it's going to recruit the immune system to come and check it out and deal with it. And it was used in many childhood vaccines from the 1930s all the way through to in fact, mercury used to be used as a treatment for certain conditions back in the 1930s, but that's a whole nother podcast. Mercury is a well-known neurotoxin. So even low levels of mercury, methylmercury from maternal fish consumption, prenatally are associated with neurodevelopmental deficits. In the 1990s, as the number of infant vaccines increased, there started to be some concerns around the cumulative mercury dose from thimerosal-containing vaccines might, over time, exceed federal safety limits for infant exposure. As a precautionary move, the manufacturers removed from most United States pediatric vaccines by 2001, with the exception of the flu vaccine. And this provided a natural experiment. So if we're the major cause of autism, rates should have decreased in birth cohorts after it was removed. Several epidemiologic studies in Denmark, Canada, California, and elsewhere reported no decrease in autism after it was phased out, which of course has been cited as evidence against the vaccine autism hypothesis. However, critics point out that autism rates continue to increase even faster after 2001, suggesting that removing one ingredient did not eliminate the risk, possibly because other factors like the growing number of aluminum adjuvanted vaccines maintained or worsened the overall risk. It's also possible that mercury contributed to autism in the 1990s and early 2000s, but its effect was masked by the introduction of new vaccines or by diagnostic lags. So in other words, it could be that the effect was basically, it's hard to see the effect because at the same time as it's eliminated, new vaccines also get introduced. So you're getting increased toxicity, but in a different way, and from a different source, the aluminum versus the mercury. Or there's also just the simple possibility that it takes time for the diagnosis to be made after the mercury was injected. And so because of that, you may not see the result until several years later. Thimerosal exposure in utero and infancy remains a concern. Maternal flu shots definitely still contain thimerosal. Infant flu vaccines also still often contain mercury, meaning that even to this day, some babies are still continuing to receive ethyl mercury in those flu shots. Lab evidence supports mercury's ability to cause autism-like damage. In 2004 study by Mary Hornig and her colleagues at Columbia University demonstrated that autoimmune-prone mouse strains injected with thimerosal, this is basically a mouse that is prone to developing autoimmune disease, which obviously many of us are prone to developing autoimmune diseases as well, that when they were injected with marisol at vaccine level doses, exhibited autism relevant neurobehavioral abnormalities, whereas the mice not predisposed to autoimmunity did not. And this study, which is titled Neurotoxic Effects of Postnatal Marisol Are Mouse Strain Dependent, was published in 2004 in the journal Molecular Psychiatry. The susceptible mice show developmental delays, reduced social exploratory behavior, and neuropathological changes in the brain. So this experiment is interesting because it highlights an important concept, which is that genetic susceptibility alters the effects of mercury. It points to the idea that there's only a subset of children, perhaps those with challenges detoxifying mercury, maybe mitochondrial dysfunction or immune susceptibilities, particular sensitivities, might regress into autism after mercury exposure. Other children may not. And that aligns with the observation that not every child vaccinated with mercury-containing shots becomes autistic, obviously. Mechanistically, that ethyl mercury from the vaccines can accumulate in the brain as inorganic mercury. Don't believe the hype that people who say, oh, ethyl mercury is totally safe. That's not true. That's in reference to the idea that it basically goes into the brain fast. It doesn't hang around in the blood the way methylmercury does. But when they've looked at brains, cadaver brains, they find the ethyl mercury. They're like, oh, there it is in the brain tissue. The whole claim that, oh, ethyl mercury is fine because we don't see it in the blood is like, where is it then? So definitely that ethyl mercury can accumulate in the brain as inorganic mercury, disrupt the biochemical processes, depletes glutathione, which is our body's main chelating agent, antioxidant, and one of the ways that our body helps get rid of mercury. It induces oxidative stress. It can kill neurons, literally directly kill neurons and glial cells at sufficient concentrations. There's a great video that the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology has where they show under a microscope nerve cells when they get exposed to mercury, what happens. And they're looking at it more from like a fillings perspective because the silver fillings will have mercury in them as well. And it turns out that they actually like off gas or put off a little bit of mercury over time continuously. And it also turns out that that mercury is neurotoxic. So in infants, who are, of course, are much more susceptible because their blood-brain barrier and immune system are really immature, you get amplified effects. Mercury is also going to be able to synergize with other toxins. There are studies that are suggesting that mercury plus aluminum together is more neurotoxic than either one alone. So we're looking at multiplicative effects versus just an additive effect. And we think that may be because aluminum can actually enhance mercury uptake into organs. So that's a great segue to looking at aluminum. Any questions before we do that?
Aluminum. I know that it was banned in IV nutrition for infants. Why are we still injecting babies with aluminum at months 2, 4, and 6? These tiny babies.
Yeah, and 12 and 15. Yeah, it's a good question. And the justification is that it's heightening the immune system response to the viral or bacterial antigen that you're giving it in the vaccine. And certainly after thimerosal was removed and we still saw the autism rates continue to increase, attention increasingly turned to the aluminum and its use as an adjuvant in almost all of the childhood vaccines, if not all of them. I'm pretty sure that it is. Adjuvants, we've talked about how they heighten the immune system's response to the viral or bacterial antigen. Aluminum salts, like aluminum hydroxide and aluminum phosphate, are the most common adjuvants that are used in childhood vaccines. And as you mentioned, babies today receive aluminum adjuvanted vaccines at 2, 4, 6, 12, and 15 months of age. It's included in the vaccines for hepatitis B, diphtheria, tetanus, attenuated pertussis or DTaP, the HIV or Hib vaccine, which is Haemophilus influenza B, pneumococcus, and others. The total aluminum load in the first year of life from vaccine can exceed 4 milligrams, which is a dose that many toxicologists and neuroscientists argue is unsafe for vulnerable developing nervous systems. And you can look at the data from that. There's a study in the journal Immunologic Research from 2013, aluminum in the central nervous system, toxicity in humans and animals, vaccine adjuvants and autoimmunity by Shaw et al. And let's see, also, oh no, okay. So aluminum has also been recognized as a neurotoxin in other contexts. So, for instance, chronic aluminum exposure has been linked to cognitive impairment and is implicated in dialysis encephalopathy and even Alzheimer's disease, which is where I first heard about aluminum's neurotoxic effect, because this was probably before I was even in school. I remember my mother telling me that, oh, we have to stop using aluminum foil and stop using uncoated aluminum pots and pans to cook anything acidic in, or frankly, we don't cook in them at all anymore, because basically the aluminum is reacting with the acid and it's going into the food, and that has been linked to Alzheimer's. The neurotoxic effect of aluminum is not a new idea, but the route of exposure in vaccines, this intramuscular injection, is different from dietary. When you ingest it dietarily, you at least have a shot of protecting and minimizing the absorption. When you directly inject it, you're having aluminum nanoparticles that are going to persist in the body, that are going to travel around. And there was research by R.K. Girardi and his colleagues in France that found that aluminum adjuvant injected into the muscle can be taken up by immune cells, particularly macrophages, transported via the bloodstream or lymphatic system, and eventually accumulate in the brain, where they incite inflammation or impair neural function.
So why are we pretending that it's still inert when it clearly passes into the brain and causes inflammation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's really part of what we're looking at here, is why are we still doing what we're doing, given that we have evidence that actually this is a neurotoxic thing. It's taken up in the bloodstream or in the lymph and eventually can accumulate in the brain. And I think that is the fundamental question that you're asking. I think that the typical pushback that I have seen, and I forget whether we get to this, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about it briefly, is they say, well, okay, so the levels of aluminum that they're getting from a dose of vaccine on that particular day may exceed safety limits. But if we take that aluminum and we include all the other aluminum that they're getting exposed to for the year, and we extend it over the course of the year, then the average exposure for the year is not significantly elevated. The problem with that analysis is that toxicity doesn't work that way. Toxicity is not like, well, we're going to tally up your toxic burden for the year, and then at the end of the year, you're going to pay the IRS your toxic burden for the year. It's like, no. If the level goes high at any particular point, then the body has to deal with it, and it can have toxic effects. There was a 2013 review of aluminum, and which I mentioned previously, of the central nervous system, that concluded that aluminum has clear negative impacts on neurodevelopment, and noted a significant correlation between the number of aluminum-containing vaccines and autism rates across countries. The authors also pointed out that many features of aluminum-induced neurotoxicity overlap with those seen in autism, and proposed that aluminum's propensity to trigger immune activation could lead to brain inflammation or autoimmunity in genetically susceptible children. We have empirical studies supporting these concerns. For example, in another group there was a team at the University of British Columbia that performed a pilot experiment where young mice were injected with aluminum adjuvant at doses and timing analogous to the infant vaccine schedule. And the aluminum exposed mice showed social behavior deficits, anomalies in social interaction tests compared to the ones that were injected with saline.
Yeah, a lot of those peer-reviewed studies on mice showing that aluminum triggers social deficit were labeled as misinformation. Like, why?
Yeah, well, why do you think?
I want your science brain to tell me what you think.
Well, I think it's because that their findings.
I tell you in my passionate, and I'll come from being a mom that loves my boys, but I'm gonna keep it cool, okay?
Right. No, fair enough. I think that anytime the findings of a study cast doubt or contradict the narrative that is the narrative that supports the profits of big corporations, there is inevitable pushback. And one of the prime tools in the toolkit that's used is, oh, this is misinformation.
I'm a critically thinking mom with grit. How powerful that is. Like on force, if all mothers constituted themselves as that.
Yeah. I mentioned this study before in the Journal of Inorganic Chemistry 2018. In this study, they found these behavioral changes in the mice, including reduced social interest, altered social novelty response. These are all reminiscent of core autism symptoms. This is a really important study because it's the first direct evidence in an animal model that aluminum adjuvant alone, without any specific virus or antigen, could impair neurodevelopment in ways that mimic autism in the mice. It complements the earlier work by Shaw et al. From 2013, which found that neonatal mice given multiple aluminum adjuvanted vaccines developed significant motor neuron degeneration and neurological damage consistent with Gulf War syndrome, which is another illness linked to aluminum adjuvants. So collectively, these studies make it biologically plausible that routine exposure to aluminum adjuvants, as occurs in vaccinated infants, could contribute to neurodevelopmental harm. The mechanism by which aluminum is thought to induce autism involves chronic brain inflammation. These aluminum particles can activate the innate immune system, for example, stimulating inflammasomes and glia, which is basically the brain's resident immune cells that are designed to protect the brain from infection. You can get persistent activation of these microglia as well as astroglia in brains of individuals with autism. In fact, that's been documented as well. The study I would reference you to is from the Annals of Neurology, 2005, January. Neuroglial activation and neuroinflammation in the brain of patients with autism. Vargas et al. Were the authors. So this study that Vargas et al. Published in 2005 found an active neuroinflammatory process in autistic brain tissue characterized by widespread microglial activation and elevated inflammatory cytokines in the cerebrospinal fluid. So these authors suggested that the innate neuroimmune reactions are playing a pathogenic role in autism. So neuroinflammation, immunotoxicity is playing a pathogenic role in autism. Again, begs the question, what could be driving this chronic brain inflammation in autistic children? And one potential driver is repeated immune activation during critical periods of early brain development. We know that vaccines are intended to activate the immune system so that we generate antibodies. And while that immune stimulation is usually transient, the cumulative effect of many vaccines in a short span, especially those containing strong adjuvants, could conceivably tip some infants into a state of immune overdrive. And I think, frankly, we see this. There's a study that I don't have cited here, but I remember reading it when I was in school. It came out of, I believe, Switzerland, showing that it was comparing children who had received the typical schedule versus ones who had not, that those who had received the vaccine schedule had significantly higher rates of asthma, autoimmunity, atopic conditions like eczema, which are all associated with immune overdrive, right? So this is just basically the way you have to think about this is like the model of autism that's starting to emerge as of this 2018 study is like autism is like asthma of the brain, right? It's an oversimplification, right? But it's like an immune overdrive targeting the brain cells. And this is sometimes referred to as the immune overload hypothesis, the idea that you get this immature nervous and immune system of certain children that just can't handle the barrage of insults from these current vaccine schedule without adverse consequences. And we get supporting evidence from this hypothesis from the field of maternal immune activation, because it's well established actually in both human epidemiology and animal models that infections in a mother during pregnancy, which cause a surge of inflammatory cytokines, molecular messengers, can increase the risk of autism in her offspring. It is well established in both human epidemiology and animal models that infections in a mother during pregnancy can increase the risk of autism in her offspring. In these cases, it's not the pathogen per se, but actually the mother's immune response that disrupts the fetal brain development. So a good analogy here would be that similarly, the postnatal immune activation, so after birth, immune activation from the vaccines may have a similar effect in that early period after birth when the brain is undergoing rapid synaptogenesis and growth. So it's growing, forming new synapses, and would be equally, or at least maybe not equally, but also highly susceptible to inflammation. So beyond mercury and aluminum, there are other vaccine components and aspects of the vaccine schedule that have been proposed as potentially contributing to autism. One of those is the combination of multiple vaccines given together, potential interactions among ingredients, the practice of vaccinating during times of vulnerability. For example, when a child has an underlying infection or mitochondrial impairment are all definitely factors to consider. I've heard stories of basically people being told, oh, it's fine that they have a runny nose, or it's fine that they were sick 2 days ago. No, it's not. You should wait at least 2 weeks is what the guidelines say. So the live virus MMR vaccine doesn't have mercury or aluminum, but it has been a focal point of concern because there have been some significant case reports of regression after the MMR around age 1. So some people have hypothesized, and this is consistent again with Wakefield's earlier work, that the MMR could trigger like a chronic subclinical measles infection in the gut because it is a live virus vaccine. So it contains a live virus, which means it can revert back to measles, but it may not be strong enough of a version of measles to actually cause the measles, but it could create an infection in the gut or an autoimmune reaction that then ultimately affects the brain. So this is more of like a cutting edge idea that I would say there's not as much evidence for, but it's interesting because it's worth noting because of the fact that it has that brain inflammation and loss of acquired skills, which often happens when you have encephalopathy, inflammation of the protective covering of the brain. Incorrect. Encephalopathy is when you actually have brain inflammation. And this is well known to have occurred, not commonly, but rarely after measles infection and also after the measles vaccine. And there have been some cases in the vaccine injury courts that they have acknowledged that vaccines precipitated autism-like conditions in children with underlying medical vulnerabilities. So the famous case is one of Hannah Pauling. I remember when this case happened because it was a big deal. This was a child where they were able to actually, the parents, I think the father was a doctor, I want to say, and he was able to do the very boutique, expensive, we have to send your stuff all the way to France and do this testing to find out you have it, because I don't even think we do this testing in the United States. At least we didn't back when this case was going on. So this child, Hannah Pauling, had a mitochondrial disorder, and at the same time as having this mitochondrial disorder, regressed into autism after a series of vaccines. And when they looked at her genetics, they saw the mitochondrial disorder. That ultimately, the confluence of the mitochondrial disorder, the series of vaccinations, and the timing, the temporality, resulted in the federal government, the Justice Department, which is actually the one that's defending against the parents. It's literally, I don't know if you realize this, but like the taxpayer funded Justice Department fights against the parents who are trying to get compensation for their child's vaccine injury. And so literally it's the Justice Department's job to try to prove that your child is not vaccine injured. I don't know if you know that, but that's pretty wild. But they had to concede, even in this case, that the vaccines aggravated an underlying encephalopathy, which then manifested as autism. This case, I think, pretty strongly suggests that there's identifiable subpopulations, for example, like children with mitochondrial dysfunction, children with chronic immune deficiencies, genetic mutations in detoxification pathways, who are at special risk for neurodevelopmental injury from vaccines and, frankly, other sources as well. But for purposes of this conversation, vaccines would definitely be on that list. And these are not going to be picked up in broad population studies that treat children as, oh, all children are basically the same, which I've always thought that's wild.
How would you test for that though? Like as a mom, if you wanted to follow an intelligent vaccination schedule, delayed and check titers, could you actually test for those underlying
Mitochondrial dysfunction,
and others, etc.?
well, yeah, it's an interesting question. With regard to the mitochondrial disorders, like I said, there's a series of tests. I forget the name of the lab in France where you got to send off blood all the way to France and get them to do the evaluation, because you're not looking at like the child's DNA, you're looking at their mitochondrial DNA, which is like a really specialized testing that they only do
Right.
at this lab in France. That's something that at our pediatric clinic when I was in school that we offered to patients, but it's not a routine lab. It's not a lab that even most pediatricians would have any idea about. So that's what you have to realize, is that this is highly specialized. And there's a lot of autism specialists who probably don't even know about it. So,
what about other tests?
well, there's looking at, for example, aluminum, and we'll get into this in a minute in terms of clues for treatment. We're almost there, but I would say that you can look at, for example, aluminum levels in red blood cells. You can look at aluminum levels in the hair, the urine. You can see how the body's dealing with it. We know, for example, that aluminum levels in the hair and the urine of children with autism seem to be higher, which is an indication that their body is potentially exposed to a higher level of those things vis-a-vis children who don't have. And that, I think there's this conception of like, oh, vaccines are all basically the same. They're all standardized and made perfectly identical to each other. And it's like, no, they're not. Absolutely not. First of all, there's no incentive for them to do that, because again, if they mess up a batch, it's like, oh, well, if those kids have a problem, they can take it to the vaccine court. There's no way that vaccine companies get hit if they make a batch and let it go out to the market that has got 2, 3, 4 times the proper amount. And you really think that the FDA is checking every single batch? They can't.
No.
They don't have the resources.
My point in asking is that the accessibility to these tests, even if parents wanted to do it, is
Well, these tests aren't covered by insurance, any insurance.
yeah.
To look at RBC aluminum or no, because again, the conventional medical establishment decides, literally every single insurance company has a conventional medical doctor deciding what tests get covered and what tests don't. And if the FDA has not approved a particular relationship between a particular lab test and some sort of diagnosis or some sort of treatment response, then typically that test is not going to be covered by insurance. And that's the case for all of these tests predominantly. If you have a true vaccine reaction, sometimes we can tie it to a particular ingredient, and sometimes we can test for those and get them covered by insurance. And we do that in our patients who've had a vaccine reaction or think that they've had a vaccine reaction. We have a panel we use in our practice where we look at every single vaccine ingredient that we can test for in the blood and in the urine and see, okay, what are the levels in this child or in this person? Do they have an allergy to the protein that's in this particular vaccine? And there's some vaccines that have egg protein in them. And I believe there's some sort of collagen protein of some kind in one of them. Or, yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I'd have to pull up the macro that I've created for vaccine basically to evaluate a patient to see if they're eligible for a vaccine exemption, we have to actually show in the lab work. In the state of California, it's very strict. We have to show proof that there is an actual reaction immunologically that can be detected in the blood. It's not just, oh, I had this vaccine and I had a reaction, and so now I don't want to get any vaccines, or I don't want to get that vaccine even. You have to show in the blood that, yes, there is a persistent IgE level reaction to that particular ingredient that's causing the susceptibility to that particular vaccine. It's a very, I would say, burdensome and overly strict law. But I understand that there's a lot of fear, and we're going to get to this at the very end,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of fear around what if we just let people not be vaccinated? Like, what would happen to society? Like, we'd all get, if we drop below that herd immunity level, and how horrible that would be, and mortality would just skyrocket, right? So that's the concern. And I think that it's worth taking a look at, but I think that you might be surprised by what the result there is. All right. So we talked about how the broad population studies that treat children as all the same are not going to pick up these signals. And also that the mechanism of synergistic toxicity, so multiple hits, you've got a genetic predisposition plus exposure to vaccine mercury plus an immune activation from an illness or an adjuvant, the aluminum coming in. The Dr. Walter Krinian, who was one of my mentors at school, would always say, think of toxicity like a barrel. And if there's constantly toxins dripping in this barrel, eventually, if you don't let the spigot out at the end, the barrel's going to start overflowing. And that's when you get symptoms. So all of these toxic exposures combine to push the child over the threshold into autism. And just to recap, looking at the biologically plausible mechanisms that exist linking vaccines to autism pathophysiology include, number one, heavy metals like the mercury and the aluminum present in the vaccines that are very capable of neurotoxic and immunotoxic effects consistent with findings in autism. So that's oxidative stress, microglial activation, impaired synapse formation. Number three, the activation of immune system by the vaccines, while typically safe in isolation. And again, I would say safe in quotes because we can take a look at some other non-autism related effects of vaccine and immunotoxicity and overactivation could become harmful if amplified or repeated excessively in susceptible individuals. So that's the key piece there is number four, susceptible individuals. And that results in that perfect storm scenario in which a child with these subtle vulnerabilities is then exposed to a series of immunological and toxic challenges early in life, leads to the neuroinflammation and the developmental regression. So vaccines, by design, deliver these immune challenges frequently in the first years of life. So from that standpoint, it is entirely feasible that the vaccination program, again, not any one particular vaccine, but the vaccination program, particularly the cumulative exposure to ingredients like aluminum and the frequency and the timing of these immunizations has been a driving factor in the emergence of the autism on a truly epidemic scale.